Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the sensory world of mice. Now, the long-held understanding is pretty clear. They're whiskers, primarily for touch.
Right. Like super sensitive feeler.
Exactly, especially vital for navigating, dark places like their burrows.
That's absolutely right. For decades, really, research has focused almost entirely on that tactile aspect of whisking, how it helps them detect objects, understand their space, when vision isn't much help. It's in the bedrock.
But, science loves a good twist. And we've got some fascinating new research that's really challenging that view.
Hmm.
We've been looking at a summary of findings from the Weizmann Institute of Science. It was published in Current Biology. And it turns out mice might also be sort of hearing their way around, using subtle sounds their whiskers make.
Yeah, it's quite something, this idea that mice are using a much more integrated sensory approach than we ever imagined. It's not just about feeling anymore. It seems there's this whole auditory layer to how they perceive the world through whiskers.
Exactly. So our mission on this deep dive is to really unpack this discovery. It's pretty intriguing. We want to understand how these sounds are generated, how the brain processes them, and, what this might mean.
For our understanding of animal senses generally, yeah.
And maybe even potential tech applications down the line. Okay, so let's get into it. Starting with that traditional idea, whisking as touch.
Right. So, as you said, the established view, primarily tactile. Mice actively sweep their whiskers back and forth, right? And when they make contact,
They get info.
exactly, detailed information, size, shape, texture, location of an object. And this is absolutely crucial for them. Moving in tight spaces, finding food, spotting danger, especially when they can't see well.
Right, like in those dark underground burrows you mentioned. Sight's not doing much good there.
Precisely. So for years, the scientific focus has been, well, all about the mechanics, how the whiskers move, the sensory cells at the base.
And how those touch signals get processed in the brain.
And that research has given us an incredibly valuable picture of, somatosensation, the sense of touch. But this new study, it adds a whole new dimension. The researchers at Weizmann, they made the surprising discovery. When whiskers brush against surfaces, they actually create tiny sounds.
Tiny is the word, isn't it? I mean, Professor Alan Lampel, who led the team, he even said whiskers are so delicate that no one had thought of checking whether they produce sounds that mice are able to hear.
Exactly.
It's one of those things that makes you think, wow, how did we miss that?
It really does.
Yeah.
It shows how even systems we think we understand well can still look secrets. And these aren't just any sounds. The research showed they're ultrasonic.
So way beyond what we humans can hear.
Correct. And to pick up these incredibly faint sounds, the team had to use very sensitive microphones. They placed them really close, about 2 centimeters away from the whisker, which is roughly the distance from a mouse's own ear to its whiskers.
Clever setup.
Yeah. And they recorded these sounds as the whiskers brushed against different things like dried bougainvillea leaves and even aluminum foil.
Okay, so the sounds are there. They recorded them. But the big question is, does the mouse's brain actually do anything with these sounds? Is it meaningful input?
That's the crucial part.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, right? The auditory cortex experiment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to figure that out, the researchers measured neural activity, brain activity specifically in the auditory cortex while the mice were whisking against objects. Now here's the kicker, the really key part of the experiment. They actually interrupted the nerve pathways carrying the touch information.
Wait, hang on. They blocked the sense of touch from the whiskers?
They did. Temporarily blocked those tactile signals going to the brain.
Wow. Okay, so what happened?
Well, despite that blocked no-touch signals getting through, they found the auditory cortex still lit up. It responded to the sounds the whiskers were making.
No way.
Yes. And that's a really critical piece of evidence. It shows the brain is processing these sounds as a separate thing, a distinct sensory input.
So it wasn't just like an echo of a touch sensation.
Precisely. It was a specific auditory signal being received and processed by the hearing part of the brain, independent of touch.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So even with touch turned off, the brain's getting sound information from the whiskers. But how do we know the mice actually use this, like, to perceive things? This is where the AI comes in, I gather.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
To dig into that, they used machine learning, AI. They trained one AI model to identify different objects just by looking at the patterns of brain activity in the auditory cortex during whisking.
Okay.
And remarkably, the model could do it. It can successfully tell the objects apart based on that neural activity alone,
Wow.
which, challenges that traditional idea of senses working in neat little boxes. It suggests things are much more interconnected.
Okay, so the brain activity patterns held the information, and then they did the same thing, but just with the sound recording.
Yes, exactly. They trained a different AI model. This one only got the ultrasonic sound recordings made by the whiskers brushing the objects.
Hmm.
It could also recognize the objects. And here's the really interesting part. The accuracy of both AI models, the brain activity one and the sound recording one, was pretty much the same,
Yes.
comparable.
Okay, that's really strong evidence then. It implies the information in the auditory cortex is the acoustic information from the whiskers.
It strongly suggests that, yes.
But the ultimate test is the mouse itself, right? Did the mice actually use this sound information behaviorally?
That's the million-dollar question. So they did a behavioral experiment. They used mice where, again, the sense of touch in their whiskers was temporarily knocked out.
Okay, same setup as before.
Right. And they trained these mice to recognize aluminum foil, but only using the sound their whiskers made when they brushed against it. No touch allowed.
So they had to learn the sound of foil.
Essentially, yes. And the results? Pretty clear. The mice could consistently identify the aluminum foil just based on those subtle whisker sounds.
Wow. So even without feeling it, they learned to recognize it by its whisper? That's incredible.
It really is.
It perfectly backs up what Professor Lampel said, that the brain's whisking network, the Vibrusa system, it operates in this integrative, multimodal way.
It's not just one sense firing. It's a combination working together when they're actively exploring.
Which naturally leads to the question,
Okay.
why? What's the evolutionary benefit of having this dual sense?
Good question. And the article offers some compelling ideas there.
Yeah, thinking about survival, right? Avoiding predators, finding food.
Exactly. For instance, the researchers suggest maybe a mouse needs to choose its path. Does it cross a noisy, dry field where an owl might hear it easily?
Or a quieter, maybe damper, fresher field.
Right. The faint sounds from whisking could give it that information about the ground texture of the environment without making loud movements itself, stealth sensing.
Stealth sensing. I like that. It makes perfect sense. Like getting intel quietly.
And then there's the other example they gave.
Yeah.
Figuring out if a plant stem is, say, hollow and dry, or maybe solid and juicy.
By the sound the whisker makes brushing against it before taking a bite.
Exactly. It just adds this layer of, well, sophistication to how they sense things.
Yeah.
Helps them make better, more informed decisions.
It really does challenge how we've traditionally compartmentalized senses, like touch and hearing being totally separate.
Absolutely.
So let's zoom out. What does this all mean for the bigger picture? Beyond just, cool mouse facts, what are the broader implications, maybe technological ones?
Well, fundamentally, it just underscores the brain's amazing plasticity and ability to integrate diverse information streams. It really opens up new avenues for research into how sensory processing works at a basic level. How does the brain merge different inputs into one coherent perception of reality?
And thinking about technology, the article mentions some really exciting possibilities. Prosthetics, for one.
Yes, that's a fascinating angle, taking inspiration from this mouse system. Imagine developing prosthetics that don't just give tactile feedback.
But also auditory feedback.
Right, subtle sound cues alongside touch. It could potentially create a much richer, more natural experience for the user.
Like a prosthetic hand that lets you feel an object and gives you sound cues about its texture or how hard you're gripping it.
Precisely. Now, of course, there are technical hurdles. How do you implement that meaningfully? What sounds work best? But the principle is there.
It's a great idea. And the connection to sensory rehabilitation, too. The article mentioned how visually impaired people sometimes use the sound of a white cane.
Existing learning exercises use that.
Could this new understanding maybe lead to better techniques, leveraging other subtle auditory cues for spatial awareness?
It's certainly a possibility, a promising direction. If we understand better how the brain naturally integrates these faint sounds, maybe we can develop better sensory substitution or enhancement tools.
Helping people perceive their environment more effectively.
Potentially, yes.
And then there's robotics. Dr. Ben Efron was quoted saying that integrating different senses is a huge challenge in robotics.
It absolutely is.
And it sounds like the mouse brain's whisking system could offer some, inspiration there.
Definitely. Think about robots needing to navigate in tricky conditions, like smoke or dust, where vision is useless.
Right.
If they could use subtle auditory cues, maybe generated by sensors brushing against things, like the whiskers,
Yeah.
it could lead to smarter early warning systems, better collision avoidance, better navigation.
Creating systems that gather and interpret a richer mix of sensory data, more like how the mouse does it.
Exactly.
Before we wrap this up, there was one little detail in the article, that science numbers bit, about the whiskers themselves, just how fine they are.
Oh, yeah, that was striking. Mouse whiskers, they're only 40 to 80 microns thick at the base,
Which is tiny.
and they taper down to just 3 to 4 microns at the tip, which is roughly the same diameter as a human hair.
It really drives home how incredibly sensitive these things must be to both make and potentially detect such faint sounds.
Absolutely. The physics of it are quite amazing.
Okay, so to bring this all together for our deep dive, the key takeaway seems pretty clear. Mice are using this really sophisticated multisensory system. It involves both touch and the subtle sounds their whiskers make as they explore.
And that fundamentally challenges that older view of their sensory world, and even how we think about the boundaries between touch and hearing.
Yeah, it blurs the lines.
And as we've talked about, the potential impact goes way beyond mouse biology. It opens up exciting research directions in neuroscience.
And holds real promise for tech, prosthetics, sensory rehab, robotics.
The cross-disciplinary nature of it is really quite remarkable.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, if this subtle sound sensing ability evolved in mice, something easily overlooked, what other quiet, maybe seemingly insignificant sensory signals might be playing a huge role for other animals? Or even for us humans?
Are there things we're missing?
Exactly. What might we be missing just because we focus too narrowly on the obvious dominant senses? It's definitely some food for thought.
Indeed it is.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive today.